I agree that we should also be discussing other contexts, such as the ones this commenter mentioned. If we're to make decisions based on increasing safety and reducing the likelihood of harm, it would be the logical decision to allow trans women in rape crisis centres, domestic violence centres, etc., including ones that are women only. It is critical to have proper services accessible to victims and survivors of all genders, but one of the reasons why women-only services exist is because the vast majority of victims of rape and intimate partner violence are women, with the majority of perpetrators being cisgender men. There are so many complex intersecting reasons for gender-based violence that goes beyond just these abusers being horrible as individuals. These types of crimes are deeply rooted in socio-cultural gender inequality, as is enabled by patriarchal structures. Gender often informs the experiences of survivors, so it can be useful to have gender-specific services to facilitate the provision of more specialized support. Importantly, having women-only domestic violence shelters or areas of a shelter specifically designated to women will tangibly increase the safety of the residents, since men are most likely to be perpetrators of these kind of crimes. Of course, not all men, we know, but the men who don't pose a threat will likely understand why men having access to these areas would be a bad idea. Statistics also indicate that trans women are no more likely to be perpetrators of abuse than cis women are. So, all else being equal, a trans woman in a domestic violence shelter is no more of a risk than a cis woman. Of course, both trans and cis women are capable of being abusers, but statistically speaking, they both pose a pretty low risk. Trans women are not immune to the sexism, misogyny, and patriarchal frameworks that are at the root of these types of crimes. On top of experiencing all the things that make cis women more likely to be vulnerable to gender-based violence, transness is often a factor in gender-based violence perpetrated against trans women. Resultingly, trans women are even more likely than cis women to be victims of gender-based violence. In regards to prisons, people will similarly profess that housing a trans woman with cis women will pose a risk to the safety of cis women. But again, all else being equal, a trans woman poses no more of a risk than a cis woman. On the contrary, housing trans women in men's facilities poses huge risks to the safety of the trans women. They are disproportionately more likely to become victims of violence, especially sexual violence. But there's a much wider discussion here. Unlike places like domestic violence shelters, which are specifically designed to be safe and secure, prisons aren't safe. We know that there's a problem with men raping men in prisons, so much so that it's become this disgusting cultural joke. People are being thrown in with known sexual predators, often as a form of unofficial punishment, and even the prison staff are raping and abusing inmates. And there are so many more means of harm in addition to the risk of sexual abuse. In my opinion, our current prison system is not only corrupt, but fundamentally flawed, and we'd be much better just getting rid of the whole thing and completely devising another system that actually works and prioritizes citizen safety. But I'm trying to stay on topic here. You probably could find a couple examples of trans women abusing cis women in prisons, just as there are cis women who have abused other cis women in prisons. But on a macro level, housing trans women in women's prisons really isn't a safety issue, and there are actual safety issues that are being overlooked with all this unwarranted fear-mongering. If, upon hearing this and doing some fact-checking, you still feel uncomfortable with the idea of the occasional trans women being in a women's domestic violence shelter or a women's prison, then you probably believe that the life of trans women are less important than the lives of cis women, in which case this is just transphobia and not about concerns of harm. You could be an outright disgusting transphobic bigot using women's safety as a guise, but I suspect that there are many otherwise decent people who have unknowingly internalized some of the anti-trans fear-mongering that's especially rampant right now. If you're in the latter camp, then it's not totally your fault because nobody's immune to propaganda, but it is absolutely your responsibility to dismantle your own bigotries and ensure you're not harming others. Lastly, I should point out that the referenced Supreme Court ruling is just a small part of the escalating wave of attacks on basic civil rights for trans people, which makes it all the more evident that this profession of protecting women is merely a guise. Trans rights and women's rights aren't mutually exclusive. If we're to learn anything from history, it's to be skeptical of when a vulnerable minority group that makes up a tiny percentage of the total population is being blamed for huge systemic issues.